The rain hissed against the study window like a serpent's warning, each droplet a whispered secret sliding down the glass. Elena moved through the dim room with the practiced invisibility of the help, her cloth tracing slow circles across the mahogany desk's gleaming surface. The wood caught what little light remained in the dying afternoon, reflecting nothing of her face, nothing of her existence. She shouldn't have been there at all. The study was Marco's domain, forbidden territory after 6 in the evening, but Signora Isabella had insisted the desk be polished before tonight's meeting. Elena had learned long ago not to question the Signora's orders, no matter how strange their timing. The phone lay half-hidden beneath a stack of leather-bound ledgers, its screen glowing with an incoming call. Elena's hand stilled on the desk. She should leave. She should. The route is confirmed. Isabella's voice cut through the silence, sharp as broken glass, intimate as a lover's confession. Via Colombo, 11:30. Your men will be waiting. Elena's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She stood frozen, cloth pressed against the wood, her reflection finally visible in its polished surface. Wide eyes, pale face, a ghost caught in the wrong moment. Marco's convoy takes that route every Thursday. Isabella's laugh was soft, conspiratorial, speaking to someone Elena couldn't hear. He's so predictable, so arrogant. By midnight you'll have what you want and I'll have what I need, his empire, his accounts, everything. The cloth slipped from Elena's fingers, landing on the desk with a whisper that sounded like a gunshot in the terrible quiet. Her heart hammered against her ribs, each beat screaming one word, "Run! Run! Run!" But her feet wouldn't move, couldn't move, because if Isabella knew she had heard, if she turned and saw— Thursday night, Isabella continued, oblivious. The neurotoxin works in seconds. No suffering, they promised, almost merciful, really. Another soft laugh. Though mercy is more than he's ever shown anyone. Elena's hand found the edge of the desk, gripping it to keep herself upright. The neurotoxin, via Colombo, 11:30, Thursday, tonight. The words burned themselves into her mind like brands, each one a death sentence. Marco's death sentence, and possibly her own. The floorboard beneath her foot groaned, a tiny sound that might as well have been a scream. "I have to go," Isabella said quickly, her voice suddenly different, alert. "Someone's—" The phone went dark. Elena heard the rustle of fabric, the sharp click of heels on marble moving toward the desk, toward her. She grabbed the cloth with shaking hands, began polishing again with mechanical desperation, her breath coming in short, silent gasps. The study door opened behind her. Not Isabella. Marco's silhouette filled the doorframe, broad shoulders blocking out the light from the hallway. He was early. He was never early. Elena felt his gaze settle on her back, like the weight of a blade between her shoulder blades, cold and precise. "Elena." His voice was granite, each syllable carved from stone. "Why are you in my study?" She turned slowly, the cloth clutched in her white-knuckled hands, and met his eyes. Dark eyes, calculating eyes, the eyes of a man who had built an empire, unknowing when people lied. "The Signora." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "She asked me to polish the desk before your meeting tonight, Signore." Marco's gaze moved from her face to the desk, to the phone lying there in plain view, its screen still dark. Something shifted in his expression, a dangerous stillness that made Elena's survival instincts scream. "I see," he said softly. "And did you polish it well?" "Yes, signore." The lie tasted like ash. The truth would taste like poison. Behind him, Isabella appeared in the hallway, her face composed into perfect innocence, but Elena saw the calculation in her eyes, the question. What did she hear? Marco saw it too. He saw everything. The rain continued its soft hiss against the window, witness to nothing, condemning no one. But in that moment, as Marco's eyes moved between his wife and his maid, Elena understood with terrible clarity that survival would require more than silence. It would require a choice, and she had less than 5 hours to make it. Isabella moved first, her voice cutting through the tension like a whip crack. "Marco, darling, I found her lurking in your study. I've told you before, this one has sticky fingers and a curious nature. She was going through your papers when I walked past." The accusation landed between them like a thrown knife. Elena's breath caught, her denial dying in her throat before it could form. To defend herself was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny meant questions she couldn't answer without revealing what she'd heard. Marco's gaze remained fixed on Elena, but she could feel him processing his wife's words, weighing them against what he saw. His silence stretched out, filling the room with a pressure that made Elena's ears ring. This quiet was worse than rage, worse than accusations. It was the silence of a predator deciding whether to kill quickly or slowly. "Look at her," Isabella continued, moving closer to her husband, her hand touching his arm with practiced intimacy. "Guilty as sin, she can't even speak." But Elena saw what Isabella couldn't. The minute tightening of Marco's jaw, the way his eyes flicked to his wife's face for just a fraction of a second, reading something there that made his expression go even colder. He knew his wife. He knew when she performed. Elena's mind raced through her options like a drowning woman grasping for driftwood. Stay silent, and Isabella's accusation stands. Marco might believe it, might have her thrown out or worse. Speak the truth, and Isabella would know she'd been overheard. She'd be dead before morning. But there was a third option, narrow as a razor's edge. The neurotoxin. The specific word Isabella had used, medical and precise. Most wouldn't know it. But Elena's mother had been a nurse before the cancer took her. Had whispered warnings in old rhymes to keep her daughter safe from the poisons that lived in medicine cabinets. Elena dropped to her knees, reaching for the polishing cloth she'd let fall. Her hands trembled as she retrieved it, and she let them tremble, let them see her fear, because fear was expected, fear was safe. But as she rose, she began to whisper, so soft that Marco had to lean forward to hear. Red on the bottle, death in the dose, sweet as the sugar, cold as the rose. Her mother's rhyme, the one about poisons that killed without trace. She met Marco's eyes for just a heartbeat, saw the sharp intelligence there catch on the words like a hook in flesh. His hand lifted, stopping Isabella's next accusation before it could form. "Leave us," he said, his voice empty of inflection. "Marco, leave us." Isabella's mouth thinned into a hard line, but she obeyed, her heels clicking away down the marble hallway. The sound faded, and Elena was alone with a man who killed without hesitation, holding nothing but a childhood rhyme and a desperate gamble. Marco moved closer until she could smell his cologne, expensive and cold. "Say it again." She did, her voice barely a breath. His eyes never left hers, reading her terror, her truth, searching for deception and finding only the raw edge of survival. Via Colombo, she whispered. 11:30. Tonight. The words hung between them like a confession and a condemnation both. Something flickered behind Marco's eyes, so brief Elena might have imagined it. A crack in the granite, a shadow of recognition. But then his face was stone again, impenetrable, revealing nothing. He stepped back, and the distance he put between them felt calculated, deliberate. "You will return to your duties," he said, his voice carrying the same inflection I might use to order coffee. "Both of you. I have calls to make before tonight's route." Elena's stomach dropped. The dismissal was worse than rage, worse than threats. It meant he didn't believe her. Or worse, he did believe her, and had already decided her fate. Isabella's fate. All their fates. "Marco," Elena started, but his hand lifted, cutting her off with the absolute authority of a man who expected obedience. "Leave. Now." She backed toward the door, her legs unsteady, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that she'd miscalculated, that the bullet would come before she reached the hallway. Her shoulders tensed, waiting for the impact, for the explosion of sound that would be the last thing she ever heard. The door closed behind her with a soft click. No bullet, no shout. Just the terrible silence of not knowing. Elena walked down the hallway on legs that barely held her, past Isabella, who stood near the grand staircase with her arms crossed, her expression smug with victory. She thought she'd won. She thought Marco had dismissed the maid's ravings as the desperate lies of someone caught where she shouldn't be. She had no idea what Elena had really said. Behind the closed door of his study, Marco stood motionless for 3 full seconds. Then he moved with the efficiency of a man who had survived in his world by trusting his instincts more than his heart. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialed. "Cancel Via Colombo. All units, all routes." His voice was ice. "New coordinates in 10 minutes, and Antonio. Prepare a welcome for uninvited guests." The calls came rapid-fire after that, each one precise, each one shifting pieces on a chessboard only he could see. He gave no explanation, offered no justification. His men knew better than to question. By the time he set the phone down, the trap was set, reversed, waiting with teeth bared. The rain had strengthened by 11:30, turning Via Colombo into a river of reflected streetlights. The rival gang's men waited in position, weapons ready, watching for headlights that would never come. They didn't see Marco's soldiers moving through the shadows behind them until it was too late. The gunfire was brief, efficient, brutal. Bodies crumpled to the wet asphalt, blood mixing with rain, painting the street in dark rivulets. No civilians, no witnesses, just a message written in the dead. Marco Ferretti does not die easily. By midnight, it was over. Marco stood in his study once more, a glass of scotch untouched on his desk, looking out at the rain. His phone had rung 7 times. Confirmations, body counts, the name of the traitor who'd brokered the deal. All information he'd already suspected. All confirmation that the warning had been real. Read on the bottle, death in the dose. The rhyme circled through his mind like a prayer, like a curse, a maid, a nobody. A woman so invisible he couldn't recall her face before tonight, and now she was seared into his memory with the permanence of survival. She had saved his life. More accurately, she had saved herself by saving him, which made her either brilliantly opportunistic or genuinely terrified. Probably both. But the reason didn't matter as much as the fact. She knew. She'd heard Isabella. She'd understood what it meant, and she'd chosen him. The problem crystallized in his mind with perfect, cold clarity. Elena was a witness to his wife's betrayal. She was proof of Isabella's attempted murder, of her conspiracy with his enemies. She was leverage, evidence, a living testament to treachery. She was also a liability. If Isabella suspected the maid had talked, Elena was dead. If his enemies learned she'd warned him, Elena was dead. If his own men saw her as the reason for tonight's bloodshed, the butterfly wing that flapped and changed everything, her life expectancy could be measured in hours. But she'd saved his life with a nursery rhyme and a moment of terrified courage. Marco set down his glass. Outside, the rain continued its endless percussion. Inside, a decision formed with the weight of inevitability. The maid could not be a maid anymore. She was a problem that required a solution, and Marco Ferretti had never been a man who left problems unsolved. The dining room glittered with crystal and malice. 22 members of the family sat around the mahogany table that could seat 30, their faces carefully neutral, their eyes watchful. The mandatory Friday dinner was tradition, a display of unity that fooled no one. Everyone knew what these gatherings really were: a stage for power, an arena for blood sport dressed in fine china and expensive wine. Elena moved along the periphery with a silver tray, refilling glasses, invisible again. She'd barely slept in the 2 days since Via Colombo, since the bodies on the wet asphalt, since the silence from Marco that felt like a held breath before a scream. She'd expected to be dismissed, disappeared, dealt with in whatever efficient way men like him dealt with inconvenient witnesses. Instead, she'd been summoned here, to serve, to be present. Isabella sat at the far end of the table in a dress of deep crimson, her smile sharp and satisfied as she held court with Marco's cousins. She believed herself untouchable. Her husband had taken the Via Colombo route as scheduled. The news had reported a minor traffic delay, nothing more. Whatever had happened, whoever had died, the secret remained buried, and the maid who'd dared whisper warnings, clearly dismissed as the ravings of a frightened girl. Elena saw the smugness in every gesture Isabella made, the way she touched the diamonds at her throat, the way she laughed too loudly at her own jokes. A woman who thought she'd won. Marco sat at the head of the table, silent as stone, his dinner untouched. He'd spoken perhaps 10 words since the meal began, acknowledging toasts with the barest nod, his face revealing nothing. But Elena had learned to read the stillness in powerful men. It wasn't peace. It was the quiet before devastation. His glass struck the table with a sharp crack that cut through the conversation like a blade. Silence fell instantly, absolute. "Isabella," Marco said, his voice carrying the weight of verdict. "Stand." She blinked, her smile faltering. "Darling, what?" "Stand." The command was stone. She stood, her hands smoothing her dress, confusion flickering across her carefully made-up face. Around the table, the family members shifted in their seats, sensing blood in the water. Marco rose as well, his movements deliberate, controlled. 7 years, he said, his gaze fixed on his wife with the cold precision of a surgeon selecting where to cut. 7 years of marriage. 7 years of your decorating my arm, spending my money, playing the role of devoted wife. Isabella's smile returned, uncertain now. "Marco, this isn't—" "7 years," he continued, speaking over her as if she hadn't spoken at all. "And you have given me nothing. No heir, no alliance, no value beyond your face, and even that requires increasing maintenance. The gasps around the table were sharp. Immediate. This wasn't done. Private failures weren't displayed at family dinners, weren't weaponized in front of witnesses. But Marco continued, relentless. "You cannot give me an heir," he said, each word precise as a bullet. "The doctors confirmed it months ago. You are barren, Isabella, empty, useless." The color drained from Isabella's face, shock giving way to humiliation, then to rage. "How dare you? You bastard, you have no right. I have every right." Marco's voice dropped lower, more dangerous. "This is my house, my table, my family. And you have proven yourself incapable of the one duty a wife owes." His gaze cut across the room, finding Elena near the doorway, still holding the silver tray, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack her ribs. No, he wouldn't. "Her," Marco said, and the word fell like an executioner's axe. "The maid, Elena." 22 pairs of eyes turned to her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, trapped in the sudden spotlight of their collective attention. "Her worth is proven," Marco continued, his voice carrying absolute authority. "She will take your place." The silence that followed was suffocating. Isabella's face twisted, disbelief warring with fury. "You cannot. She's a servant. She's nothing. You cannot possibly." "I can." Marco's hand lifted, and 2 of his men materialized at Isabella's sides, their grip on her arms gentle but immovable. "And I have. You will be escorted to the guest house. Your belongings will follow. This marriage is finished." "Marco!" Isabella's scream was raw, desperate, all composure shattered. "Marco, please, you can't do this, not for her, not for some little whore." But he'd already turned away, his attention back on Elena, pinning her in place with a gaze that held no warmth, no affection, nothing but cold calculation and absolute certainty. "Come here," he said. Elena's legs moved without her permission, carrying her forward through the frozen tableau of shocked faces, past Isabella who lunged against her guard's hold, spitting curses. The silver tray slipped from her nerveless fingers, clattering to the marble floor. She stopped before Marco, looking up at the man who just claimed her like property, like a chess piece moved into position. His hand reached out, gripped her chin, tilted her face up to the light so everyone could see. "What is mine, I keep," he said to the room, though his eyes never left hers. "What is useless, I discard." And in that moment, Elena understood with terrible clarity. She hadn't been saved. She'd been acquired. The silence in the dining room was absolute, a living thing that pressed against Elena's eardrums until they ached. 22 faces stared at her with expressions ranging from shock to calculation to barely concealed disgust. Marco's uncle, a gray-haired man with cruel eyes, leaned back in his chair with a slight smile, as if watching a particularly entertaining play. His aunt's mouth had fallen open, her wineglass frozen halfway to her lips. The younger cousins exchanged glances, already recalculating alliances, weighing this new reality against their ambitions. This wasn't impulse. This was strategy, brutal and efficient. Marco had just humiliated his wife, elevated a maid, and demonstrated to everyone present that sentiment meant nothing, that anyone could be replaced, that loyalty to him was the only currency with value. The cruelty was the point. The shock was the message. Elena felt a hand close around her upper arm, not Marco's, one of his guards, A man whose name she didn't know, whose face she'd never dared look at directly. His grip was iron, neither gentle nor rough, simply inexorable as he pulled her forward another step. She stumbled, her maid's uniform suddenly feeling like a costume in a play she didn't know the lines to. Marco's hand reached for her face, and she flinched before she could stop herself. His fingers caught her chin anyway, cold as marble, tilting her head up until she had no choice but to meet his eyes. This close, she could see the calculation there, the absolute certainty of a man who'd never doubted his own power. He studied her face like he might study a horse he was considering purchasing, assessing value, looking for flaws. "Look at them," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Let them see you're real. Let them see what choice looks like." She didn't understand, but she obeyed because disobedience wasn't an option anymore. Her gaze swept across the table, meeting eyes that quickly looked away, that couldn't quite process what they were seeing. A maid, a nobody, being claimed by Marco Ferretti in front of everyone who mattered. Marco released her chin but kept her close, his hand moving to the small of her back, a touch that looked almost protective to the observers but felt like a brand against her spine. He turned to address the room, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king addressing his court. "What is mine, I keep," he said, and the words weren't a statement. They were a vow, a threat, a promise carved in stone. "What is useless, I discard. This is the law of my house. This has always been the law." His gaze swept the table, daring anyone to object, to question, to show even a flicker of dissent. No one did. Even his uncle's smile had faded into cautious neutrality. "Isabella!" The scream tore through the silence like breaking glass. Marco's soon-to-be former wife thrashed against the guard's hold, her carefully styled hair coming loose, her crimson dress suddenly looking like a wound. "You cannot do this. I am your wife. Your wife. This little whore, this nothing. You think she can replace me? You think—" The guards hauled her backward, toward the door, but Isabella fought them with the fury of someone watching their entire world crumble. Her eyes locked on Elena, and the hatred there was pure, absolute, murderous. "I'll kill you!" Isabella shrieked, spittle flying from her painted lips. "You hear me, you little bitch? I will gut you myself. I will watch you bleed. I will—" The door slammed shut, cutting off her threats, but they echoed in the sudden quiet like a curse. Elena's blood had gone cold, her breath coming in short gasps she couldn't quite control. She wanted to run, to disappear back into the invisible spaces where maids belonged, but Marco's hand on her back kept her pinned in place, on display. "The announcement will be made tomorrow," Marco said to the room, his tone suggesting the matter was already concluded, no discussion necessary. "The wedding will follow within the week. I expect your attendance and your discretion." It wasn't a request. His cousins nodded, murmuring agreement. His aunt finally set down her wine glass with shaking hands. His uncle's gaze drifted to Elena, assessing, calculating what this shift in power might mean for his own position. Marco's hand pressed more firmly against Elena's back, guiding her toward the door, away from the table. She moved like a puppet, her legs mechanical, her mind screaming warnings her body couldn't obey. This was survival, she told herself. This was living. Marco had chosen her over Isabella, had elevated her from nothing to something, had given her protection, status, safety. but as they passed through the doorway into the quiet hallway, as the murmur of shocked conversation erupted behind them, Elena felt the truth settle into her bones like poison. She'd survived via Colombo. She'd survived Isabella's accusation. She'd survived the ambush and its aftermath. And now she had to survive being Marco Ferretti's prize. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. Warning him had been the easy part. Living with the consequences might kill her anyway. Isabella's threats echoed in her mind, promising violence, promising death. And Isabella had allies, resources, connections that didn't die just because Marco declared her useless. Elena had saved Marco's life with a childhood rhyme. Now he'd claimed hers with a dinner announcement. She wasn't sure which of them had made the worse bargain. The master suite stretched before Elena like a cathedral built for emptiness. Cream silk wallpaper caught the lamplight, turning the walls to butter and gold, while the bed, obscenely large, draped in linens she couldn't name, dominated the space like an altar. Her attic room had been the size of this bathroom, all rough wooden beams and a narrow cot that creaked when she turned over. She'd been able to touch both walls if she stretched her arms wide. Here, she could walk 20 paces in any direction and still find only air, only space, only the suffocating luxury of her new prison. The closet held clothes she hadn't chosen, designer labels in her exact size. Someone had measured her while she slept, or perhaps Marco had simply looked at her once and known. The thought made her skin crawl. On the vanity, cosmetics gleamed in their expensive packaging, lined up like soldiers awaiting orders. Everything perfectly curated. Everything controlled. The wedding had taken 3 hours from announcement to completion. A priest had been summoned, his hand shaking so badly he'd nearly dropped the Bible twice. Elena had watched him fumble through the ceremony with the wide-eyed terror of a man who understood exactly what he was officiating. Not a marriage, but a transaction. Not holy vows, but a legally binding claim of ownership. Marco's voice had been steady as stone through his vows, each word deliberate and final. When the priest had pronounced them married, his relief had been palpable, fleeing the moment he was dismissed as if the devil himself snapped at his heels. The ring sat on her finger now, platinum and diamonds, impossibly heavy for something so small. Elena kept looking at it, catching flashes of light, feeling the weight like a shackle made beautiful. A brand dressed in brilliance. She tried to take it off once, alone in the bathroom, but it wouldn't slide past her knuckle. Too perfectly sized, or perhaps her hands had already begun to swell with the stress her body couldn't voice. Marco's rules had been delivered with the same clinical precision he might use to explain how to load a gun. She was never to be alone, not truly. Guards would be stationed outside every door, would follow her everywhere except the bathroom, and even then they'd wait just outside. She was never to accept food or drink from anyone but the head chef, and even then, Marco would taste it first. She was not to leave the compound without his explicit permission and his personal escort. She was his property now, and what was his, he protected with the same ruthless efficiency he used to destroy his enemies. The first night, he didn't touch her. He sat in the leather armchair by the window, still dressed in his wedding suit, watching her with eyes that revealed nothing. Elena had stood frozen by the bed for what felt like hours, unsure if she should undress, should speak, should acknowledge the absurdity of a wedding night spent under surveillance. Finally, she'd climbed onto the bed fully clothed, pulling the covers up like armor, feeling his gaze on her like a physical weight. He never moved, never spoke, just watched, a silent sentinel keeping guard over his newest acquisition. And as exhaustion finally dragged her under, Elena understood with devastating clarity what she'd become in saving his life. Not his wife, not his partner, not even entirely his victim. She was both queen and prisoner, elevated and trapped, the bait in a trap he'd set using her own survival as the lure. She was treasure, he'd claimed, yes, but treasure had no freedom. It simply existed to be guarded, displayed, and kept from those who might steal it away. The realization didn't bring tears. She'd cried herself dry in the hours after the dinner. Instead, it brought a strange, cold acceptance. She'd chosen survival on Via Colombo. Now she had to survive the consequences of being chosen in return. A week passed in tense silence, each day teaching Elena the intricate choreography of her new existence. She learned which hallways the guards patrolled at what hours, which staff members averted their eyes when she passed, and which ones studied her with calculating interest. She learned that breakfast was served at 7 precisely, that Marco took his coffee black and expected her to pour it, that he read the financial reports before speaking a single word to anyone, including her. She learned the weight of being watched constantly, of never having a moment where someone's gaze wasn't cataloging her movements, assessing threats, measuring her value against the cost of her protection. The house revealed itself to her in layers, not as a home but as a fortress, every corner designed for defense, every window positioned with sightlines in mind. She was learning to be its mistress, but the house belonged to Marco, and she was simply another possession it contained. The vase was wrong on Tuesday morning. Elena noticed it immediately, the way it sat 3 inches to the left of where it should be on the console table in her sitting room. She'd straightened it yesterday afternoon, had run her finger along its rim, counting the hand-painted roses as a way to ground herself in something tangible. Now it sat askew, and the wrongness of it made her stomach clench with cold dread. Someone had been in her rooms. Someone had moved through her space, touched her things, left this small violation as a calling card. She moved to the window, drawn by instinct, and caught it, the faintest trace of perfume hanging in the air near the gauzy curtains. Jasmine and amber, expensive and distinctive, a scent she'd smelled 1,000 times while cleaning Isabella's bedroom. The window stood open just a crack, enough to let in the autumn chill, enough for someone slim to have slipped through if they'd been determined, if they'd been angry enough, if they'd wanted to send a message. Elena's hand reached for the window latch, and that's when the world exploded. The gunshot came first, then the sound of shattering glass, the sequence reversed in her shocked brain. The bullet punched through the window 6 inches from her head, close enough that she felt the displaced air kiss her cheek like a lover's ghost. The window spider-webbed, then collapsed inward in a glittering cascade, and Elena was on the floor without remembering how she got there, her hands over her head, her body curled into survival's instinctive shape. The door burst open with enough force to crack the frame. Marco moved like violence given human form, all controlled fury and deadly precision. His men flooded in behind him, weapons drawn, barking orders into radios, but his focus was singular, absolute. He reached Elena in 3 strides, hauling her up by her arm with a grip that would bruise, his other hand already checking her for wounds, his eyes wild with something that might have been fear if fear could look that murderous. "Did it touch you?" His voice was razors wrapped in ice, each word bitten off with barely contained rage. "Did it?" "No." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, her body shaking despite her attempts to control it. "No, I'm fine, But he wasn't listening. He was already moving again, dragging her away from the window, positioning his body between her and the shattered opening. His hand found the back of her neck, fingers pressing into the vulnerable hollow there. Not cruel, but absolutely possessive. A reminder, a brand, a warning spoken in touch rather than words. "Secure the grounds," he said to his men, his voice dropping to something even colder than before, something that made grown killers flinch. "Find the nest, find the trajectory, find anything." They scattered like drops of mercury, efficient and swift. Through the broken window, Elena could hear shouting, the thunder of boots on gravel, the organized chaos of a compound on lockdown. Marco's thumb pressed against her pulse point, feeling the frantic rhythm there, counting her heartbeats like a miser counting gold. 20 minutes later, they found the sniper's nest in the woods beyond the compound walls. Empty shell casing, disturbed leaves, a clear sightline to her window. No shooter, no trace beyond the evidence of intent. Marco's hand remained on her neck through it all, his body a wall between her and the world, his fury a cold radiation she could feel against her skin. When he finally spoke again, his lips were close to her ear, his breath warm against her chilled skin. "You understand now," he said, and it wasn't a question. "You are mine. They will kill you to hurt me, and I will burn the world down before I let them succeed." His hand tightened, just enough to make her breath catch. Possession and warning, protection and threat, all delivered in a single gesture. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the phantom touch of that bullet's passage, understanding with brutal clarity that the gilded cage had just become a battlefield, and she was standing at its center, marked for death by those who wanted to wound the man who claimed to own her. The interrogations began at midnight. Elena watched from the landing above the main hall as Marco summoned his inner circle one by one, his questions delivered with surgical precision, each man's loyalty dissected under the cold light of suspicion. His voice never rose, never wavered. That was somehow worse than shouting, that absolute control wrapped around absolute fury. Antonio, his second, went first. Then Luca, then the drivers, the accountants, the men who'd served him for years. Each emerged pale, shaken, but still breathing. Still trusted for now. The house had become a web, and Marco was pulling threads to see which ones led to poison spiders. Elena understood the necessity even as she felt the paranoia seeping through the walls like damp. Isabella's allies were embedded deep, roots twisted through the foundation of Marco's empire. The sniper hadn't appeared from nowhere. Someone had given him the schedule, the sight lines, the moment when Elena would be alone by that window. Someone inside these walls wanted her dead, badly enough to risk Marco's wrath. Elena sat in the smaller library, a book open in her lap that she hadn't turned a page of in an hour, listening to the murmur of voices below. As a maid, she'd been invisible, and invisibility had granted her access to secrets people thought were safe. The staff talked around her like she was furniture, sharing gossip, complaints, observations they'd never voice in front of their employers. She'd learned which guards gambled, which ones had mistresses, which ones sent money home to families in Sicily. She'd learned the architecture of loyalty in this house, and that knowledge was currency she hadn't known she'd need. Angelo's name surfaced in her memory like a corpse rising from deep water. The head of security, Marco's most trusted man for the exterior defenses. She'd overheard him 3 months ago, before she was anything but a shadow with a dust cloth, speaking to someone on his phone in rapid Sicilian. She'd only caught fragments. Isabella's name, a sum of money that made her breath catch, the word insurance. At the time, she'd dismissed it. Men in this house always spoke in veiled terms, always dealt in secrets. But now, with Isabella's perfume still ghosting through her memory and a bullet hole in her window, the fragments assembled themselves into a pattern she couldn't ignore. The decision came with the weight of a cliff's edge beneath her feet. To speak was to prove her value beyond being Marco's claimed prize. To stay silent was to accept helplessness, to remain merely protected rather than useful. She thought of Isabella's screaming threats, of the way Marco's hand had felt on the back of her neck. Possession, yes, but also the strangest form of partnership she'd ever known. He'd claimed her, but he'd also listened when she'd whispered about neurotoxin in Via Colombo. Elena set down the book and descended the stairs. Marco looked up as she entered his study, his expression unreadable, exhaustion carved into the lines around his eyes. He'd been at this for 4 hours, pulling his organization apart thread by thread, looking for rot. "Angelo," she said quietly, before courage could fail her. "You're head of security. 3 months ago I heard him on the phone. He mentioned Isabella's name and money." The silence that followed was absolute. Marco's eyes locked on hers, calculating, measuring the weight of her words against the risk of believing them. His inner circle's loyalty was sacred. To accuse Angelo was to accuse the foundation itself. "You're certain," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm certain of what I heard." He studied her for another 3 heartbeats, then lifted his phone. The call he made was brief, clinical. Bring Angelo to the wine cellar, now. When they dragged Angelo out 2 hours later, he was missing 3 fingers and all of his secrets. Marco's efficiency had been ruthless, brutal, exactly what Elena had expected. The head of security had been Isabella's creature for 2 years, paid handsomely to turn blind eyes at crucial moments, to ensure certain windows remained unguarded, certain schedules reached interested parties. Marco found Elena in the library where she'd returned to wait, her hands shaking around a cup of tea gone cold. He said nothing, just stood in the doorway, watching her with that impenetrable expression. Then he crossed the room and placed something on the table beside her. Angelo's security badge, bent and blood-stained. "You see what others miss," he said finally, his voice carrying a note she couldn't quite identify. Not gratitude. Marco didn't do gratitude. Recognition, perhaps. Respect. "That makes you dangerous." "To you?" she asked, meeting his eyes. "To my enemies." His hand reached out, fingers brushing her cheek with unexpected gentleness, a stark contrast to the violence he'd just enacted in the wine cellar. The unspoken understanding settled between them like a contract signed in something darker than ink. She wasn't just his possession anymore, his bait, his claimed prize. She was becoming his weapon, and they both knew it. The package arrived on Thursday afternoon, wrapped in expensive paper, and accompanied by a card embossed with the crest of the Rossini family. A peace offering, the elegant script claimed, to commemorate Marco's recent nuptials and to extend goodwill between their organizations. Inside the silk-lined box sat a bottle of Barolo, vintage 1985, worth more than most people earned in a year. The kind of gift that spoke of respect, of détente, of powerful men acknowledging one another across the chessboard of their brutal world. Marco stood in his study, turning the bottle in his hands, his expression carved from stone. Elena watched from the doorway as he examined it, noting the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the minute tension in his shoulders that she'd learned meant danger. "It's beautiful," she offered carefully, uncertain of her role in this moment. "It's bait," he said flatly, setting the bottle down as if it might detonate. He reached for his phone, the call connecting instantly. "Antonio, wine cellar. I need the chemist. Now." The testing took 3 hours. Elena waited in the library, trying to read, trying not to think about the implications of Marco's suspicion. A peace offering was supposed to signal the end of hostilities, wasn't it? Or was that naivety, the kind of thinking that got people killed in this world she'd stumbled into? When Marco finally emerged from the wine cellar, his face was a mask of cold fury that made her blood freeze. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hand finding her arm, his grip iron. "The same neurotoxin," he said, each word bitten off with brutal precision. "The exact same compound Isabella used. They laced the entire bottle." The message was clear as broken glass, sharp enough to draw blood. They knew. The Rossini family, Isabella's allies, whoever had sent that beautifully wrapped death. They knew Elena had warned Marco about Via Colombo. They knew she was the reason their ambush had failed, the reason their partnership with Isabella had crumbled into corpses on wet asphalt. And now, they were telling him, in the language of expensive wine and hidden poison, that they understood exactly where to strike to hurt him most. She wasn't just his vulnerability, she was his Achilles heel, gift-wrapped and displayed for all his enemies to see. Marco's thumb pressed against her pulse, feeling it race. "Lock down," he barked to the guards who'd materialized in the doorway. "No one in, no one out. Double the perimeter. I want eyes on every entrance, every window, every fucking crack in the walls." The house transformed around them, steel shutters sliding down over windows, the soft click of locks engaging, the thunder of boots as men took positions. Within minutes, the elegant fortress became exactly what it had always been underneath the silk and marble. A bunker designed to withstand siege. Marco pulled Elena closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face, forcing her to meet his eyes. The fury there was arctic, absolute, but underneath it she saw something else. Something that looked almost like fear if men like Marco Ferretti were capable of such weakness. "You taste nothing first," he said, his voice dropping to something that wasn't quite a whisper but wasn't quite a command either. Something raw, more honest. "Nothing touches you that doesn't touch me first. No food, no drink, no gift, no offering. If someone hands you water, you refuse it. If someone pours you wine, you wait for me. Do you understand? Marco, do you understand?" His intensity was suffocating, his grip on her face almost painful, and Elena realized with startling clarity that she'd become something more dangerous than just his claimed possession. She'd become something he couldn't afford to lose. Not because of sentiment, Marco didn't traffic in sentiment, but because losing her would mean his enemies had won, would mean he'd been vulnerable, would mean the armor he'd spent a lifetime building had a crack they could exploit. "I understand," she whispered. He held her gaze for 3 more heartbeats, then released her, turning back to his men, his face settling back into its mask of cold authority. But his hand found the small of her back as he guided her toward the reinforced safe room on the 2nd floor, and the touch carried a new weight now, a new meaning. Protection and possession, yes, but also something closer to desperation. The charity gala was a calculated risk, a public declaration that Marco Ferretti did not hide, did not cower, did not yield to threats. The venue glittered with old money and older power, crystal chandeliers casting prismatic light across faces Elena recognized from newspapers and late-night news segments. Politicians, judges, business magnates, all of them connected to the underworld in ways that would never see courtrooms, their hands clean despite the blood that financed their empires. Elena wore emerald silk that cost more than her mother's funeral, diamonds at her throat that felt like beautiful teeth. Marco had dressed her himself, or rather, had stood in the doorway while stylists transformed her into the image he required, the beautiful, silent new wife, the trophy that proved his power extended even to claiming invisible girls and making them queens. She'd learned to hold her spine straight, to let her face settle into serene blankness, to be decorative and mute, and exactly what these people expected of a Mafia wife. The performance was exhausting. Every smile calculated, every step measured. Marco's hand at her elbow guiding her through the crowd like a ship navigating treacherous waters. His men formed a loose perimeter, dressed in evening wear but unmistakably armed, their eyes constantly scanning, assessing threats. Antonio stayed close, his hand never far from the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. "Smile," Marco murmured against her ear as they paused near the champagne fountain, his breath warm against her skin. "They're watching." She smiled. The crowd pressed closer. Wealthy patrons eager to glimpse Marco's scandalous new bride, the maid he'd elevated, the woman who'd displaced Isabella Ferretti in a dinner announcement that had become legend in their circles. Elena felt their stares like hands on her skin, assessing, judging, cataloging her worth against the spectacle of her claiming. Someone jostled her from behind, an accident in the crush of bodies, or so it seemed. An elderly woman in pearls, apologizing profusely, her hand gripping Elena's arm to steady herself. Elena felt the touch, started to smile and wave off the apology, and then the needle prick was nothing, barely a ghost of sensation against her upper arm. She almost missed it entirely, might have dismissed it as the clasp of the woman's bracelet catching on her dress. But the woman's eyes met hers for just a fraction of a second, and Elena saw the cold satisfaction there, the professional detachment of someone completing a contract. The woman melted back into the crowd before Elena could draw breath to scream. Her arm burned. The sensation spread like liquid fire beneath her skin, racing up toward her shoulder, and suddenly the room tilted sideways, the chandeliers becoming streaks of light against darkness. Her legs forgot how to hold her weight. She stumbled, her hand reaching for Marco's arm, her mouth forming his name but no sound emerging. Marco's world narrowed to a single point. Elena's face going pale, her pupils dilating, her fingers clutching at his jacket with weakening strength. He saw it happen in horrible slow motion, saw the exact moment the poison hit her bloodstream, saw death reaching for what was his. The violence that erupted around him was primal, absolute. He caught Elena as she fell, sweeping her into his arms, his voice a roar that cut through the refined chatter like a chainsaw. "Clear the room! Now!" His men moved like a synchronized machine, weapons appearing, guests screaming and scattering, the charity gala dissolving into chaos. Antonio was already on his radio, calling for the doctor, for the car, for the lockdown protocols. But Marco heard none of it. His entire existence had collapsed to the woman in his arms, her breathing shallow, her eyes unfocused. "Elena." His voice came out rough, stripped of its usual granite control, raw, with something he didn't have a name for. "Elena, look at me." Her eyes struggled to find his face, her lips moving soundlessly. The poison was working fast, whatever they'd used, shutting down her nervous system with clinical efficiency. Marco's hand found her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with desperate gentleness, as if he could hold her to consciousness through sheer force of will. "Stay with me," he commanded, and for the first time in his life, Marco Ferretti heard his own voice break. "You don't have permission to leave. Do you hear me? Stay with me." Her hand found his, squeezing weakly, and he gripped it like a lifeline, like a prayer, like the only thing in the world that mattered. Around them, his men were subduing guests, searching for the woman with the needle, turning the elegant venue into a crime scene. But Marco couldn't look away from Elena's face, couldn't release the terror that had wrapped around his chest like iron bands. She'd saved him on Via Colombo with a whispered rhyme. She'd given him Angelo's name and proven her worth beyond being merely claimed. And now someone was taking her from him, stealing what he'd declared was his, demonstrating with brutal clarity that even Marco Ferretti's possession couldn't make her untouchable. "Stay," he whispered again, his forehead pressed to hers, his hand cradling her head. "Mine, you're mine, you don't get to die." Her eyes closed, and Marco felt something inside him crack apart like ice under pressure, something he'd thought had frozen solid years ago, when he'd learned that survival meant never caring about anything enough to be vulnerable. Too late, he realized, far too late. The car screamed through Rome's streets, sirens wailing, traffic scattering before them like frightened birds. Marco held Elena in the back seat, her body growing heavier against his chest, her skin taking on a waxy pallor that made his stomach twist with cold dread. Her breathing had gone shallow, each inhale a struggle, and he found himself counting them obsessively, as if keeping track could somehow keep her tethered to life. "Faster," he snarled at the driver, though they were already doing 90 through residential streets, already risking everything for speed. Antonio sat in the passenger seat, phone pressed to his ear, coordinating with the compound's medical team, his voice tight with controlled panic. Elena's hand had gone slack in Marco's grip. He squeezed it harder, willing her to squeeze back, to give him any sign she was still fighting. Nothing. Just the terrible limpness of a body surrendering to poison. The compound's gates were already open, the medical team waiting in the foyer. They had her on a gurney in seconds, rushing her toward the converted examination room on the second floor. Marco followed, his hand still gripping hers. Refusing to let go, even as the doctor, a gray-haired man named Calvino, who'd patched up more bullet wounds than surgeries, began his assessment. Monitors beeped. IVs were inserted. Elena lay still as death on the white sheets, her chest barely rising, and Calvino's expression grew grimmer with each passing second. "Tell me," Marco demanded, his voice like gravel. Calvino didn't look up from his examination. "Neurotoxin. Advanced compound, military grade. Without the specific antidote, her respiratory system will shut down within 2 hours. Maybe 3, if we're lucky. Then synthesize it." "I can't." Calvino finally met his eyes, and Marco saw defeat there, saw a doctor facing the limits of his knowledge. "I need to know the exact compound of the molecular structure. This isn't something I can guess at. Get it wrong, and I'll kill her faster." Marco's hand tightened on Elena's until her bones creaked. 2 hours, 3 if lucky. Time measured in the space between breaths, in the failing rhythm of her heart. They brought the captured rival lieutenant in 20 minutes later, dragging him into Marco's study with his face already bloody, his hands zip-tied behind his back. Marco had left Elena's side only because staying would have meant watching her die by degrees, and he needed to do something, needed to hurt someone, needed answers carved from flesh if necessary. "The antidote," Marco said, his voice empty of inflection, which made it infinitely more terrifying than rage. "Where is it?" The lieutenant spat blood on Marco's Persian rug. "Fuck you!" Antonio's fist connected with his jaw, snapping his head back. Another blow to the ribs. The lieutenant crumpled, gasping, but when he looked up, there was a smile on his ruined mouth. "Isabella," he wheezed. "Isabella has it. She planned the whole thing. Said you'd come crawling eventually. Said you'd beg for it like a dog." The words landed like bullets, each one finding its mark. Isabella. Of course. The woman he'd humiliated publicly, stripped of status and home, who'd sworn screaming vengeance as his guards dragged her away. She'd orchestrated this. The woman with the needle, the poison, the timing. All of it designed to force Marco into an impossible choice. Let Elena die, maintain his power, show his enemies that nothing and no one could manipulate him, or beg his ex-wife for the antidote, show weakness, admit that the maid he'd claimed actually mattered. Marco stood motionless. The silence in the study absolute except for the lieutenant's labored breathing. Behind him, Antonio waited, understanding the weight of this moment, the way it would define everything that came after. 2 hours, Calvino had said. Maybe 3. Elena's face flashed through Marco's mind, pale on the gurney, her hand slack in his, her breathing failing. The woman who'd whispered warnings about neurotoxin in a childhood rhyme. Who'd given him Angelo's name and proven herself more than just beautiful decoration. Who'd become something he couldn't name but couldn't lose. The decision crystallized with brutal simplicity. "Get Isabella on the phone," Marco said, his voice carved from stone. "Now." Antonio's eyes widened fractionally. Surprise, maybe respect, maybe concern for what this would cost them. But he pulled out his phone, dialing the number they'd kept active precisely for emergencies like this, the line that connected directly to the woman who'd sworn to destroy them. Marco waited for the connection, his hands steady despite the chaos screaming through his mind. He'd built his empire on never showing weakness, never yielding, never admitting that anything mattered more than power. But Elena was dying in the room above him, and power meant nothing if he was too much of a coward to save what was his. The phone clicked. Isabella's voice came through, dripping with smug satisfaction. "Hello, Marco," she purred. "I've been waiting for your call." Marco pressed the speaker button, letting Isabella's voice fill the study, letting Antonio and the other men hear every word. Let them see this, he thought grimly. Let them see what he was willing to do. "I assume you're calling about your little maid," Isabella continued, each word soaked in venom disguised as honey. "Such a tragedy, so young, so pretty, and dying so unnecessarily." Marco's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level. "You have the antidote." "I do." The satisfaction in her tone was palpable, thick enough to choke on. "And you want it. Desperately, I imagine. Tell me, Marco, how does it feel? Knowing that the woman you humiliated me for is dying in your arms. Knowing that all your power, all your money, all your men, none of it can save her without me? Name your price." Isabella's laugh was sharp, cruel. "Oh, I've thought about this moment for weeks, imagined it in such detail. My price is simple, really. You. Your public surrender. You'll stand before the families, before everyone who matters, and you'll admit that you were wrong to discard me, that the maid means nothing, that you beg my forgiveness." "And then?" Marco asked, though he already knew. "And then you'll put a bullet in your own head, right there, in front of everyone. Your life for the antidote. Your empire crumbles, your name becomes a cautionary tale, and I get to watch the great Marco Ferretti reduced to a lovesick fool who died for a servant." The silence in the study was absolute. Antonio's face had gone white, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon as if he could shoot the voice coming from the speaker. The other men shifted, their expressions caught between horror and disbelief. Marco looked at the phone for 3 long seconds, his face revealing nothing. Then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to something colder than Isabella had ever heard from him. "Counteroffer," he said softly. "You give me the antidote in the next 30 minutes, or I send you Dante Rossini's head in a box." The line went silent. Isabella's breathing stopped mid-inhale. "You're bluffing," she said, but the confidence had cracked, uncertainty bleeding through. "Am I?" Marco's smile was a predator's expression, all teeth and no warmth. "Via Trastevere, number 47, the apartment above the wine shop. That's where you've been keeping him, isn't it? Your lover. Your partner in this pathetic attempt at revenge. Did you really think I wouldn't know? That I wouldn't have eyes on every property you've touched in the last month?" He heard her breath catch, heard the sudden scrabble of movement on her end of the line. "My men are outside his door right now," Marco continued, his voice carved from ice. "Antonio, what's the status?" Antonio lifted his own phone, another call already connected. "In position, boss. Say the word." "Isabella." Marco's voice lost all pretense of civility, becoming something raw and absolute. "You have 2 choices. Give me the antidote and Dante dies quickly, a bullet to the head. You'll never see it coming, painless, almost merciful." He paused, letting the silence stretch, letting her imagination fill in the blanks. "Or refuse, and I'll have him brought to the wine cellar. You remember Angelo's fate? 3 fingers before he talked." "Dante will last longer. Days, probably. I'll send you recordings. Every scream, every plea, every time he begs for death that I won't grant him." And when Elena dies because you wanted your petty revenge, I'll make sure Dante knows it was your choice that kept him suffering." The silence on the line was different now, heavy, suffocating. The sound of calculations being recalculated, of certainty dissolving into cold fear. "You're insane," Isabella whispered. "I'm motivated," Marco corrected. "You tried to teach me a lesson about weakness, about caring for the wrong person. Let me teach you one instead. What's mine, I keep. What threatens mine, I destroy. Every connection you have to this plot, every ally who helped you, every hand that touched that needle, I will burn them all to ash, starting with Dante." He heard something break on her end, glass maybe, or pottery, the sound of fury meeting helplessness. "The antidote," he said, his voice returning to that terrible emptiness that was somehow worse than rage. "You have 28 minutes now. The clock is running, and Dante is running out of time to die easy." The silence stretched for 10 seconds. 15, 20. Marco waited, his hand gripping the desk hard enough to make the wood creak, every fiber of his being focused on not looking at the clock, not calculating how much time Elena had left, not letting Isabella hear the desperation that clawed at his throat. "Piazza Navona," Isabella finally said, her voice hollow with defeat. "The fountain. 20 minutes. I'll leave it there." "You'll deliver it personally," Marco countered. "My men will be watching. Any sign of a trap, any hesitation, and Dante starts screaming. Do we understand each other?" "You bastard," she hissed, but there was no fight left in it. Just bitter, impotent rage. 20 minutes, Marco repeated, and ended the call. The study erupted in motion, men dispatching, orders flying, vehicles starting. But Marco stood still for 3 heartbeats, his hands braced on the desk, his head bowed. He'd just threatened torture, had leveraged another human being suffering, had proven himself exactly the monster Isabella had always claimed he was. And he'd do it again, without hesitation, without remorse. Because Elena was dying upstairs and nothing else mattered. The medical room had become a tomb lit by fluorescent lights and the steady beep of monitors. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness like a boat slipping its moorings, each time surfacing for shorter periods, her grip on the world weakening with every labored breath. Her eyes would flutter open, unfocused, searching for something she couldn't name, then close again as the poison dragged her back under. Marco sat beside her bed, his chair pulled close enough that his knee touched the metal frame. He'd shed his jacket hours ago, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie discarded somewhere in the chaos. One hand gripped hers while the other rested on the bed's railing, white-knuckled, holding on as if his physical grip could anchor her to life. Calvino monitored her vitals with grim efficiency, adjusting IV drips, checking her pupils, his expression growing more concerned as the minutes ticked past. Her blood pressure was dropping, her breathing shallower, her body surrendering by degrees to the neurotoxin flooding her system. 17 minutes, Antonio said quietly from the doorway, tracking the timeline with military precision. 17 minutes since Isabella agreed, 3 minutes to reach Piazza Navona, 14 minutes back if they drove like demons. Marco said nothing. His eyes never left Elena's face, cataloging every flutter of her eyelids, every shallow rise of her chest, memorizing the architecture of her features as if he could hold her here through sheer force of observation. Her hand twitched in his. a weak flutter that might have been intentional or might have been her nervous system misfiring. Marco leaned closer, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, a gesture that had become unconscious, automatic. 15 minutes, Antonio updated. The cold exterior Marco had worn like armor since childhood. The granite face, the emotionless control, the absolute certainty that caring was weakness, finally cracked. It happened slowly. Like ice splitting under pressure, fractures spreading through his composure until something raw and terrible emerged beneath. "You cannot die," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the monitor's beeping. His forehead pressed against their joined hands, his eyes closed against the sight of her fading. "Do you hear me, Elena? You cannot die, you are mine." The possessiveness in his words was absolute, primal, stripped of any pretense of strategy or calculation. Not his wife, not his asset, not his tool. Simply his. The way oxygen was his, the way his heartbeat was his, the way survival itself had become inextricably tied to her continued existence. "Mine," he repeated, the word breaking on his lips like a prayer, like a curse, like a confession he'd never meant to speak aloud. "You're mine, and what's mine doesn't leave. Doesn't die, doesn't surrender." Elena's breathing hitched, a horrible rattling sound that made Calvino's head snap up in alarm. Her lips moved soundlessly, trying to form words her failing body couldn't support. "Don't," Marco commanded, his hand tightening on hers with desperate gentleness. "Don't speak. Don't waste your strength. Just stay. Just—" The door burst open. Antonio stood there, chest heaving, his hand extended with a small vial clutched in his fingers like a holy relic. "We have it." Marco snatched the vial, his hand shaking for the first time anyone could remember seeing. Calvino was already moving, preparing the syringe with practiced efficiency, his movement swift and sure despite the pressure. "This is it," the doctor said, drawing the clear liquid into the needle. "If Isabella gave us the real antidote, she'll stabilize within minutes. If not, it's real," Marco said with absolute certainty, though he had no way of knowing. Isabella wanted him to suffer, but she wanted Dante alive more. The math was simple, brutal, and his only hope. Calvino found Elena's vein, inserted the needle with careful precision, and pressed the plunger. The antidote flowed into her bloodstream, racing against a poison already shutting down her systems, life and death mixing in her veins. Marco watched the monitors, his hand still gripping Elena's, his breathing synchronized with hers as if he could will his own strength into her failing body. The seconds stretched into eternity, each heartbeat a battle, each breath a war. "Come on," he whispered, his voice raw. "Come on, Elena, stay with me, stay." The monitor's beeping remained steady, then stuttered. Then, impossibly, miraculously, began to strengthen. Elena woke to the quiet hum of medical equipment and the strange lightness of a body that had forgotten how to die. Her throat burned, her limbs felt distant and heavy, but she was breathing. Real breaths, deep ones. The kind that filled her lungs instead of just ghosting across the surface. The fluorescent lights above had been dimmed to something almost gentle, and through the haze of returning consciousness, she became aware of weight on her left wrist. Not restraints, a hand. She turned her head slowly, the movement taking more effort than it should, and found Marco slumped in the chair beside her bed. He'd pulled it so close that his knees pressed against the metal frame, his upper body folded forward in exhausted collapse. His hand circled her wrist, fingers resting against her pulse point as if he'd fallen asleep counting her heartbeats. His other arm was braced on the bed's edge, his head pillowed on his forearm, dark hair falling across his face in uncharacteristic disarray. She'd never seen him sleep before, had never seen him anything less than perfectly controlled, his face an impenetrable mask, his posture that of a man always ready for attack. But sleep had stripped away his defenses, leaving something startlingly vulnerable in their absence. The hard lines of his face had softened, exhaustion carved into the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his jaw finally released. He looked younger somehow, and infinitely more human, less the cold Mafia king and more just a man who'd kept vigil through the darkest hours of night. The warmth she saw there was unfamiliar, unsettling. This wasn't the calculated possession of their wedding night, the strategic claiming at the dinner table, the cold fury when bullets shattered windows. This was something raw, something that looked almost like fear's aftermath, like relief painted across features that rarely showed either. Elena's breath caught as understanding crystallized with painful clarity. His claim on her had begun as a strategy, a way to humiliate Isabella, to demonstrate power, to acquire an asset who'd proven her worth. But somewhere between Via Colombo and the poisoned needle, between Angelo's betrayal and the desperate phone call to his ex-wife, strategy had transformed into something Marco probably hadn't intended, and certainly hadn't wanted. She'd become necessary, not convenient, not useful, not strategically valuable. Necessary. The kind of necessary that made a man threaten torture, that cracked granite composure, that kept him sitting vigil for hours with his fingers pressed to her pulse, as if letting go meant losing her entirely. The monitor's beeping shifted slightly as her heart rate increased, and Marco's eyes snapped open with the instant alertness of someone who'd trained themselves never to be truly vulnerable. For a moment, his face was blank, disoriented, and then his gaze found hers, and something electric passed between them, recognition, relief, and something darker that neither could name. He didn't move, didn't release her wrist, didn't straighten from his awkward position. Just stared at her with those dark eyes that had witnessed her near death and had broken open in response. The silence stretched between them, heavy with questions neither quite knew how to ask. Medical equipment hummed. Somewhere beyond the door, guards patrolled. The compound continued its rhythms, but in this room, time had collapsed to just this moment. Her alive against all odds, him stripped of his armor, both of them teetering on the edge of admissions they'd spent weeks avoiding. Why? Marco's voice came out wrecked, rough with exhaustion and something raw, the single word hanging in the air like a blade. Then, more specifically, the question she'd known was coming since the moment she'd whispered that childhood rhyme in his study. Why did you warn me? Not gratitude, not relief, just the fundamental question that had defined everything between them. Why she'd chosen to save him on Via Colombo. Why she'd trusted him with Isabella's betrayal. Why she'd set in motion the chain of events that had led them here, to this room, to this moment where life and death had traded places, and neither of them quite knew how to return to who they'd been before. Elena met his gaze, seeing the rawness there, the exhaustion that had stripped away his usual impenetrability. Her throat ached as she formed the words, her voice coming out barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of absolute truth. "I was scared," she said simply. "I wanted to live." The confession landed between them without artifice or poetry, as basic and brutal as survival itself. No noble intentions, no grand moral stance, no loyalty to him specifically. Just fear. Just the animal instinct to keep breathing, to see tomorrow, to not become another body disposed of quietly in the night. Marco's hand tightened fractionally on her wrist, his thumb pressing against her pulse as if verifying she was real, that this moment was happening. He studied her face for a long time, and Elena saw something shift in his expression. Not disappointment, but recognition. Understanding that cut deeper than gratitude ever could. "I was 8 years old," he said finally, his voice still rough but steadier now, each word chosen with care. "When I watched my father put a bullet in my uncle's head, right there in our kitchen, blood on the tile floor my mother had just mopped that morning." Elena's breath caught. He'd never spoken of his past, never offered anything beyond the present tense of power and control. "My uncle had stolen from the family accounts. Not much, enough to buy his mistress an apartment, to feel like a man instead of my father's shadow. Papa found out, made everyone watch, my mother, my sisters, me, said we needed to understand what betrayal cost." His gaze was distant now, seeing something decades old but still sharp enough to draw blood. "After, when they were cleaning up, my mother asked me if I understood the lesson. I was 8, I was terrified. I didn't understand loyalty or honor or family code. I just knew I wanted to live, so I said yes. I said I understood." Marco's eyes refocused on Elena, and she saw the truth there, stark and terrible. "I learned everything else later, but that first moment, that fundamental choice to say whatever kept me breathing, that was survival. That was strength. The wall of ice that had surrounded him since she'd first met him, that impenetrable fortress of cold calculation and merciless control, began to thaw in the dim medical room. Not melting entirely, not collapsing into vulnerability, but softening enough to reveal the architecture beneath. The frightened boy who'd learned to survive by becoming what his world demanded. The man who recognized that same terrible pragmatism in a maid whispering warnings about poison. "I saw myself in you," Marco admitted, and the confession carried a weight that made Elena's chest tighten. "When you knelt on my study floor and whispered that rhyme, when you met my eyes even though you were terrified, I saw strength. Not the kind that comes from training or birthright or building an empire. The kind that comes from choosing to live when dying would be easier." His free hand lifted, trembling slightly with exhaustion or emotion or both. It cupped her cheek with unexpected gentleness, his palm warm against her cool skin. Not assessing her value this time, not displaying her for others, not claiming ownership, just touching her, human to human, survivor to survivor. "That's why I claimed you," he said, his thumb tracing the hollow beneath her cheekbone. "Not because you were convenient or beautiful or useful, though you're all those things, because you reminded me what it cost to survive, what it meant to be strong enough to be terrified and still choose life." Elena's eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. "You claimed me like property. I did." He didn't flinch from the accusation, didn't dress it up in prettier language. "I don't know how to value things without possessing them. don't know how to protect what I care about without controlling it. That's what this world taught me. That's what survival required." His hand remained on her cheek, steady despite the confession that was stripping him bare. "But when I saw you collapse at that gala, when I felt you going limp in my arms," his voice caught, something breaking in it that she'd never heard before. "I understood that possession isn't the same as keeping, that claiming something doesn't mean you won't lose it, that control is an illusion we tell ourselves while everything we care about slips through our fingers anyway." The truth of the claiming finally crystallized between them, sharp and complex, and nothing like the simple transaction she'd believed it to be. He'd seen himself in her, the survivor, the pragmatist, the one who chose to live despite the cost. And in claiming her, he'd been trying to hold on to that recognition, to keep close the mirror that reflected who he'd been before the world had frozen him into stone. "I almost lost you," Marco whispered, his forehead dropping to rest against hers, his eyes closing. "Twice, and both times I realized that everything I'd built, everything I'd become, it meant nothing if you weren't there to see it." Elena's hand lifted, shaking with the effort, and covered his where it rested against her cheek. "I'm here," she said, the words both promise and question. "I'm still here." "Mine," he breathed. But it sounded different now, less like ownership, more like prayer. Recovery came in slow increments measured in hours of physical therapy and days of regaining strength. Elena learned to walk without trembling, to hold a glass without her hands shaking, to breathe without feeling the phantom burn of poison in her veins. But more than her body needed rebuilding. Her entire understanding of her place in Marco's world required reconstruction. He came to her room each evening as she healed, not to watch her sleep from an armchair like that first night, but to talk, to plan, to transform her from a claimed prize into something far more dangerous. "They see you as my weakness," Marco said one night, sitting across from her in the small sitting room adjacent to the medical suite. His jacket was off, his sleeves rolled up, the formal armor of his public persona shed for these private strategizing sessions. Isabella proved that. The Rossini family confirmed it. Everyone who wants to hurt me now knows exactly where to strike. Elena pulled the cashmere blanket tighter around her shoulders, still feeling cold despite the room's warmth. "So, I'm a liability." "No." His eyes locked on hers with absolute certainty. "You're a weapon we're going to teach them to fear." Over the following weeks, Marco became her unexpected teacher, instructing her in the subtle arts of survival in his world. Not the obvious skills. She'd never need to know how to fire a gun or negotiate territory deals. But the quieter, deadlier knowledge that only came from years of watching and learning. He taught her how to read a room, to identify the power dynamics in a conversation by who spoke first and who waited. How to wear silence like armor, letting others fill the void with their own nervous revelations. How to position herself in a space to control sightlines, to never sit with her back to doors, to mark exits before settling anywhere. The small touches that signaled ownership to observers, his hand at the small of her back, her fingers adjusting his tie, the way she poured his coffee with practiced intimacy. "You're not fragile," he told her during one lesson, his voice matter of fact. "You survived poisoning twice. You identified a traitor in my inner circle. You warned me about Via Colombo when staying silent would have been safer. but they need to see fragility. They need to believe attacking you is the path to destroying me. And when they attack, Elena asked, already knowing the answer, we'll be ready. The cold smile that crossed his face was pure predator. They'll see a vulnerable wife. They won't see the trap until it closes. The trust he placed in her was staggering and terrifying in equal measure. He shared intelligence reports with her, let her sit in on strategy meetings with Antonio in the inner circle, asked her opinion on matters that could shift the balance of power in Rome's underworld. Not because he needed her input. Marco's strategic mind was sharper than anyone's, but because he was teaching her to think like he did, to see patterns in chaos, to understand that information was the deadliest weapon they possessed. Why? She asked one evening, after he'd spent 2 hours explaining the intricate web of alliances and debts that held his empire together. Why trust me with this? Marco was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Because survival requires partnership. I built everything alone because I thought that made me invulnerable. But Via Colombo taught me otherwise. Angelo taught me otherwise. The poison taught me otherwise. His eyes found hers. You see things I miss because you learn to survive by being invisible. That's not weakness. That's an advantage I'd be stupid not to use. Elena studied his face, seeing the calculation there, but also something deeper. Genuine respect earned through blood and survival. This wasn't romance, wasn't love in any traditional sense. It was something rawer and more honest. Recognition between two people who'd learned that staying alive required being willing to become whatever the moment demanded. Teach me, she said simply. And so he did. How to wear power like expensive perfume, subtle but unmistakable. How to let people underestimate her intelligence while memorizing every word they said. How to be simultaneously decorative and deadly, beautiful and observant, his claimed wife and his most valuable asset. The bond that formed between them in those weeks had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with survival. Two people who'd learned to be ruthlessly pragmatic, who understood that sentiment was luxury they couldn't afford, who'd nevertheless found in each other something neither had expected. Partnership forged in the crucible of nearly dying. Trust built on the foundation of shared vulnerability. Marco stopped sleeping in the chair and started sleeping beside her. His arm draped across her waist in sleep, his breathing synchronized with hers. Not passion, not desire, just the comfort of knowing the other was alive, was breathing, was there. We survive together, he murmured one night in the darkness. Or we don't survive at all. Elena's hand found his, their fingers interlacing with practiced ease. Together, then, it was the closest thing to a vow either of them had spoken since the terrified priest had pronounced them married. And unlike those hollow words, this promise meant something. The information leaked through carefully selected channels, whispered in the right ears by men who knew how to make lies sound like stolen secrets. Elena Ferretti's health remained fragile after the poisoning. The doctors recommended rest, isolation, somewhere far from the stress of the compound and the constant threat of another attack. Marco, concerned for his wife's recovery, had reluctantly agreed to send her to a private villa in the countryside. Minimal security, just a few guards, a place where she could heal in peace. The bait was delicious in its apparent vulnerability, too perfect, almost. But desperation made people stupid, and Isabella had proven herself desperate enough to orchestrate 2 murder attempts. Surely she'd see this for what it appeared to be, an opportunity handed to her on a silver platter. The safe house sat nestled in the hills 2 hours north of Rome, surrounded by olive groves and forest thick enough to hide an army. It looked appropriately isolated, a converted farmhouse with cream stucco walls and terracotta roof tiles, the kind of place wealthy Romans used for weekend retreats. Security appeared light, 2 guards visible at the front gate, another patrolling the perimeter. Standard protection for a recovering invalid, nothing that would suggest Marco expected trouble. What wasn't visible were the 15 men positioned throughout the woods, night vision equipment and rifles at the ready. Antonio commanded them from a position overlooking the main approach, his radio silent but active, waiting. Marco himself had taken position in the villa's attic, watching through gaps in the roof tiles, his phone connected to every camera they'd hidden in the trees. Elena sat in the villa's sunlit living room, a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading, wearing a pale silk robe that made her look ethereal and fragile, the picture of convalescent vulnerability. Through the windows, anyone watching would see her rise occasionally to move toward the kitchen, then return to her chair by the fireplace. Predictable patterns, exploitable routines. She was terrified, but not for the reasons observers might assume. The fear came from playing this role knowing that Isabella would come, that violence would erupt in these peaceful hills, that she was bait in a trap designed to end in blood. Marco had prepared her, had walked her through every scenario, but preparation couldn't eliminate the sick anticipation of waiting for someone to try killing you. The first day passed in tense silence. Elena maintained her routine, while Marco's men held positions in the woods, fighting boredom and muscle cramps, waiting for movement that didn't come. Night fell, and they switched to thermal imaging, watching the forest for heat signatures that might indicate an approach. The second day crawled past with the same awful slowness. Elena read, paced, maintained the appearance of a woman recovering alone and unaware. She'd catch Marco's silhouette sometimes in the attic window, a shadow watching over her, and take comfort in knowing she wasn't truly alone, even when she appeared to be. On the third night, as twilight painted the hills in shades of purple and gold, Antonio's voice crackled through Marco's earpiece with 2 words that made his blood sing with anticipation. "We have movement." Elena heard it through her own hidden earpiece, the small device Marco had placed in her ear before leaving her to play Songbird in her gilded cage. Her hands tightened on her book, but she forced herself to stay still, to keep reading, to not react in any way that might alert observers to the fact that she knew they were coming. Through the villa's windows, the forest remained still, but that stillness had quality to it now. The heavy quiet of predators circling prey, of violence holding its breath before erupting. 3 heat signatures, Antonio reported, his voice barely a whisper through the radio. Eastern approach, moving through the olive grove. Military-grade suppressed weapons, body armor. Not Isabella herself, then. She'd sent professionals, people who knew how to move through terrain without detection, who'd been trained to kill efficiently and escape cleanly. Marco felt cold satisfaction settle over him. Isabella had taken the bait, had committed resources to this attack, and now she'd lose them. Elena turned a page in her book with trembling fingers. The act of maintaining normalcy while knowing armed killers were approaching required every ounce of the strength Marco had seen in her from the beginning. She was terrified. He could see it in the tension of her shoulders, the way she gripped the book too tightly. But she didn't run, didn't break character, didn't give away that this was anything but an ordinary evening. 200 meters, Antonio breathed, holding. The forest seemed to hold its breath with them. 15 men with fingers on triggers, waiting for the perfect moment. Elena, alone and visible in the lamplight, the picture of vulnerability. Marco in the attic, his own weapon ready, every muscle coiled with the anticipation of violence. 100 meters, they're splitting up. 2 to the back entrance, 1 staying in overwatch position. Good tactics, but useless against an enemy who knew they were coming. Marco allowed himself a cold smile in the darkness. Elena stood, moving toward the kitchen as she'd done every evening at this hour, maintaining the routine that said she suspected nothing, feared nothing, was simply a woman recovering from trauma in blissful isolation. The killers in the woods saw their opportunity and moved closer. Shadows separating from shadows, death approaching on silent feet. 50 meters, Antonio whispered. Elena's hand shook as she poured water from a pitcher, the glass trembling enough that water sloshed over the rim. Anyone watching might attribute it to lingering weakness from the poison. Only she knew it was anticipation, terror, and the strange exhilaration of being the center of a trap about to spring. "Contact in 30 seconds, Antonio said. "All units ready." Marco's finger moved to his trigger, his breathing steady despite the violence about to erupt. In the living room below, Elena set down her glass and returned to her chair, settling in with her book as if she had all the time in the world. The shadows at the tree line finally resolved into shapes. The first gunshot shattered the evening quiet, followed immediately by 2 more in rapid succession. Marco's men didn't waste time on warnings. The moment the assassins crossed the perimeter threshold, they became corpses waiting to happen. Through his scope, Marco watched 2 bodies drop in the olive grove, clean headshots, professional efficiency. The third assassin managed to return fire before Antonio put a bullet through his throat, the suppressed weapon making a sound like someone coughing in church. 3 minutes. That's how long Isabella's hired killers lasted against men who'd been waiting in position for 3 days. Elena remained in her chair, frozen by the sound of gunfire, her book fallen to the floor, playing terrified victim with perfect authenticity, because the terror was real even if she'd known it was coming. Her eyes were wide, her breathing rapid. Every inch of her the picture of a woman who'd just realized she was under attack. Then the front door opened and Isabella walked in. She shouldn't have been there. The plan had been to send men, to maintain deniability, to keep her own hands clean while others did the killing. But vengeance and overconfidence made for poor strategists, and Isabella had never been able to resist watching her victories unfold. She stood in the doorway, wearing designer tactical wear, black cargo pants and a fitted jacket, like she was playing dress-up as an operative. A pistol held with the awkward grip of someone who'd taken lessons but never fired in anger. "Hello, Elena," she said, her voice dripping with vindictive satisfaction. "Did you really think Marco could protect you forever?" Elena pressed herself back in the chair, her hand at her throat, her eyes darting toward the windows where the gunfire had come from. "Isabella, what? Your men? Dead, I imagine." Isabella closed the door behind her, moving deeper into the room with the confidence of someone who believed they'd already won. "Marco's probably been watching this place, but that's fine. That's perfect, actually. He gets to watch me finish what I started. Gets to see his precious little maid die while he's too far away to stop it." She was close now, close enough that Elena could smell her perfume, jasmine and amber, the scent that had lingered by her window before the first shot. Close enough to see the madness in her eyes, the obsessive need for revenge that had consumed whatever rationality she'd once possessed. "You took everything from me," Isabella hissed, the gun wavering slightly in her grip. "My husband, my home, my position. You were nothing, less than nothing, and now you're wearing my diamonds, sleeping in my bed, living my life." "I didn't." Elena's voice broke perfectly, tears streaming down her face, her whole body trembling. "I didn't want any of this. Please, Isabella, please." "Oh, you're going to beg now?" Isabella laughed, the sound brittle and unhinged. "That's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. Marco will get to hear you begging. Will get to live with the sound of it for the rest of his miserable life." Elena saw Marco's shadow move in the attic window, saw the flash of his hand signal. Now! The eruption was instantaneous and overwhelming. Windows shattered inward as Marco's men breached from 3 sides simultaneously, black-clad figures moving with military precision. Antonio came through the back door like a battering ram, his weapon trained on Isabella before she could even process what was happening. The front door burst open again, 2 more men flooding in, cutting off any escape. Isabella spun, her pistol swinging wildly, searching for targets in the chaos. She managed to squeeze off 1 shot. Wild, panicked, the bullet embedding itself in the ceiling, before Antonio's boot connected with her wrist and sent the gun skittering across the floor. She screamed then, rage and disbelief mixing into something animal as they forced her to her knees. Her eyes found Elena, still in the chair, still crying, but the terror in those tears had transformed into something else, something colder. Something that understood this had been theater from the beginning. "You," Isabella choked on the word. "You knew. You fucking knew." Marco descended from the attic. His footsteps measured and unhurried on the wooden stairs. He crossed the room in silence, his shadow falling over his ex-wife like a judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice held that terrible emptiness that was worse than rage, that absolute cold that meant death had already been decided. "You threatened what is mine." Each word fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of finality. "You poisoned her, twice. You sent men to kill her. You coordinated with my enemies. You betrayed your marriage vows, your position in this family and every protection those things offered you." Isabella's face had gone pale, the overconfidence bleeding away as reality crashed down around her. "Marco, please. There is no mercy," he said, cutting through her desperate bargaining with the absolute authority of a king, pronouncing sentence. "Not for you, not anymore." He turned to Antonio without another glance at the woman who'd once shared his name. "Take her to the wine cellar. Make sure she understands exactly what happens to people who threaten my wife. And Antonio." Marco's voice dropped lower, more intimate in its cruelty. Make it last. The scream that tore from Isabella's throat as they dragged her toward the door was pure terror. The sound of someone finally understanding that the game was over and they'd lost everything. She fought against the hands holding her, her designer tactical wear ripping, her perfectly styled hair coming loose, all the careful preparation for her moment of triumph, dissolving into the raw panic of prey realizing the trap had closed. Marco, please, I'll leave, I'll disappear, you'll never see me again, please, please. The door slammed shut, cutting off her pleas. The sudden silence was almost worse than the screaming. Elena sat very still in her chair, her hands shaking now that the performance was over, adrenaline crashing through her system in waves. Marco crossed to her, his hand gentle as he tilted her face up to meet his eyes. "You did well," he said quietly, his thumb wiping away a tear that was real despite the acting that had surrounded it. "You were perfect." She searched his face, seeing the cold satisfaction of victory there, but also something else. Relief that she was safe, that the threat had been eliminated, that he could finally stop watching her die in his nightmares. "Is it over?" she whispered. Marco pulled her to her feet, gathering her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with protective ferocity. "It's over. Isabella won't threaten you again. No one will." In the distance, beyond the closed door, Isabella's screaming started again. Elena pressed her face against Marco's shoulder and tried not to hear it, tried not to think about what was happening in that wine cellar, tried to remember that this was survival, that mercy would have gotten her killed. Marco's hand stroked her hair, his voice a murmur against her temple. "You're safe now. You're mine. And you're safe." And despite everything, despite the violence, the manipulation, the trap they'd set together using her as bait, Elena believed him. The compound's gates opened for them at dawn, the morning light painting the stone walls in shades of gold and amber. Elena watched from the car window as guards straightened at their approach, their acknowledgement different now. Not the perfunctory nods they'd given the boss's claimed prize, but something sharper, more deliberate, respect. Antonio opened her door himself, offering his hand to help her from the vehicle with a gesture that felt less like duty and more like courtesy. "Signora," he said, and the title carried weight it hadn't before. She'd been bait in their trap, had sat in that farmhouse knowing killers were coming, had played her part without breaking, even as gunfire erupted around her. That earned something in this world where courage was currency and fear was weakness. The other men who'd been positioned in those woods, who'd spent 3 days in silent watch while she performed vulnerability, nodded as she passed. One, a scarred veteran named Luca, who'd never looked at her directly before, met her eyes and said simply, "Well done, Signora." 2 words that felt like a battlefield commendation. Marco walked beside her, his hand at the small of her back, but something had shifted in the way he carried himself around her. The coldness that had defined him since Via Colombo, that granite control and distant calculation, had been replaced by something more focused, more present. He watched her not as a possession to guard, but as a partner whose movements mattered, whose thoughts he valued, whose survival was intrinsically linked to his own. They found themselves in his study that evening, the room where this had all begun with a whispered rhyme and a desperate gamble. The desk had been polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the amber light from the reading lamp. Marco poured 2 glasses of scotch, handed her one, then stood at the window looking out at the grounds where his men patrolled in careful patterns. "I need to ask you something," he said finally, his back still to her, his voice carrying an unusual uncertainty, "and I need you to answer honestly." Elena waited, the glass cold against her palm. "Do you want to leave this life?" He turned then, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I claimed you without asking, married you at gunpoint, made you a target, put you through poison and bullets and traps that used you as bait. If you want out, if you want safety somewhere far from me and this world, I'll arrange it. Money, protection, a new identity. You could disappear, be free of all of this." The offer hung between them, genuine and terrible in its implications. He was giving her a choice, the thing he'd never given her before. The freedom to walk away from the gilded cage, from the constant threat of violence, from being Elena Ferretti with all the danger that name carried. Elena looked around the study, at the desk where she'd overheard Isabella's betrayal, at the window where she'd nearly died from a sniper's bullet, at the man who'd claimed her as property, and then somehow become her partner in survival. The compound beyond these walls, once a prison, had transformed into something else through blood and poison and shared strategy. She thought of Antonio's respect, of Luca's commendation, of the way Marco's men now met her eyes instead of looking through her. She thought of the power she'd learned to wield, not violence but observation, intelligence, the deadly currency of information. She thought of Marco sleeping beside her, his arm around her waist, their breathing synchronized in the dark. "I am already home," she said quietly, and watched something crack open in Marco's expression. Relief, gratitude, something deeper that neither of them had words for yet. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his hands cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted every brutal thing he was capable of. "You're certain?" "I'm certain." The kiss when it came wasn't like their wedding kiss, that hollow performance for a terrified priest. This was something else entirely. His lips claimed hers with an intensity that spoke of partnership forged in fire, of respect earned through courage, of 2 survivors who'd found in each other something neither had known they were searching for. Not ownership, not possession. Recognition. When they finally pulled apart, Marco's forehead rested against hers, his hands still cradling her face like she was something precious and dangerous both. "Mine," he whispered. But it sounded like an oath now, like a vow that meant something. "Yours," Elena answered, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. Not because she'd been claimed or forced or trapped, but because she'd chosen this. Chosen him. Chosen survival. Chosen to be the woman who whispered warnings about poison and sat calmly while killers approached. The gilded cage had become her fortress. The man who'd claimed her had become her partner. And Elena, who'd once been invisible, who'd polished desks and disappeared into shadows, had become someone who commanded respect in a world built on violence and power. She'd survived. And in surviving, she'd found something more dangerous than safety. She'd found where she belonged. The rain sounds different now against their bedroom window. No longer a serpent's warning, but a rhythm that speaks of safety, of walls that hold instead of trap. Marco's arm curves around Elena's waist, his breath warm against her neck. A weight that means protection rather than captivity. In the darkness, his voice comes soft and certain. Mine. And Elena answers with the truth carved from poison and bullets and survival, from choosing to live when dying would have been easier, from finding home in the heart of danger. Yours. If this is the kind of dark, possessive love story that claims you, subscribe for more tales where loyalty is the only currency that matters.